patterns are there. This is Eyes on Intel.
Today is Friday, May 22nd, 2026. This is Eyes on Intel, where we pull back the heavy fabric of institutional power and look directly at the raw mechanics of enforcement operating inside our local communities. We don't look away from the contradictions. We don't settle for the sanitized press releases distributed by federal agencies. We track the money, the legal overreach, and the human collateral left behind by an apparatus that increasingly operates outside the boundaries of accountability. Today, we are documenting a profound, multi-layered systemic crisis, a moment where the friction between federal immigration enforcement, grassroots community resistance, and the federal judiciary is reaching a structural breaking point. We begin our analysis in Chicago, where a major legal precedent was just established, marking a massive victory for grassroots community defense networks and a humiliating defeat for federal overreach. The Department of Justice has completely abandoned its high-profile criminal case against former congressional candidate Kat Abou-Ghazaleh and the rest of the activists widely known as the Broadview Six. The charges, which stemmed from a disciplined, nonviolent direct action protest outside an ICE processing and staging facility, were dismissed with prejudice by Chicago's top federal prosecutor. This was not a standard prosecutorial dismissal. It was a forced retreat. The case imploded after defense attorneys successfully exposed systemic grand jury misconduct, proving that prosecutors had weaponized the grand jury process to distort facts and criminalize protected First Amendment activity. By dismissing the case with prejudice, the court has ensured that the federal government can never refile these specific charges, establishing an invaluable shield for organizers who put their bodies on the line to expose the logistics of deportation. It sends a clear signal across the country. When the state attempts to criminalize dissent, rigorous legal defense can turn the tables on the enforcers. This breakdown in the official enforcement narrative is rippling all the way to Washington, where the financial engine of this entire apparatus has suddenly stalled out in the halls of Congress. Senate Republicans were forced to punt a massive $70 billion immigration and border enforcement funding bill. For months, this corporate-backed funding package was framed as an absolute legislative certainty, a bipartisan mandate to expand detention beds and increase field operations. Yet, the legislation collapsed under its own weight due to intense internal ideological friction. But look closely at why it stalled. This wasn't a debate about human rights or policy efficacy. The package imploded because of a highly controversial backroom maneuver attempting to tie core ICE operational funding to a specific $1.8 billion anti-weaponization settlement fund and modernization projects earmarked for a private Trump ballroom. The infrastructure of federal enforcement is no longer even masquerading as a public safety mandate. It has been completely laid bare as a political bargaining chip, a mechanism of capital extraction used to line the pockets of the donor class, while the actual rank-and-file operations are left in a state of administrative limbo. Meanwhile, the physical overreach of the agency is being thoroughly dragged through the mud by the federal judiciary, exposed for utilizing tactics that resemble state-sponsored corporate espionage rather than constitutional law enforcement. In Massachusetts, a federal district court judge handed down a sweeping, massive injunction blocking a secretive, highly illegal data harvesting pipeline. For months, federal agents had been quietly bypassing federal privacy laws, covertly harvesting private, sensitive taxpayer data directly from the Internal Revenue Service to build profiles and track down undocumented individuals. The court completely halted the practice, issuing a scathing order that strictly prohibits agents from even looking at the data files they had already unlawfully acquired. Civil rights groups are publicly celebrating the ruling as a definitive check on what they openly describe as a rogue agency, an apparatus that consciously chose to weaponize and exploit the compliance of individuals who were actively trying to fulfill their societal obligations by paying taxes. It exposes a deep material contradiction. The state demands compliance with its fiscal laws, yet uses that very compliance as a trap to execute deportation maneuvers. This pattern of cutting legal corners and completely bypassing constitutional guardrails is manifesting directly on the streets, and it is finally being caught on film by everyday people refusing to be intimidated. Newly released body camera footage, fought for and shared by civil rights attorneys in the Pacific Northwest, has exposed an entirely unlawful tactical operation targeting local agricultural labor in Oregon. The video captures a scene of terrifying institutional violence, ICE agents pulling over a routine carpool van filled with farm workers on their way to work, violently smashing the vehicle's windows without warning and forcing the occupants onto the concrete pavement. The footage reveals a critical detail. A woman inside the van calmly, clearly asserted her constitutional right to remain silent, refusing to answer questions regarding her status or the status of her peers. Rather than respecting that foundational legal barrier, the agents completely bypassed her refusal by immediately deploying mobile facial recognition software to forcefully identify every individual in the vehicle. A federal judge has already reviewed the footage and slammed the entire operation as completely lawless, stating on the record that the video captures a brutal, systemic arrest first, justify later strategy that actively subverts basic constitutional protections. It shows that in the fields of Oregon, the law is treated by agents not as a boundary, but as an inconvenience to be smashed through. The fallout from these lawless tactical maneuvers is fueling an unprecedented legislative reckoning on Capitol Hill, driven by a coalition of advocates who refuse to allow federal actors to hide behind badges. The ACLU has launched a major coordinated legislative campaign to pass the Constitutional Accountability Act, legislation designed with a singular, radical objective: to completely strip federal immigration agents of their absolute immunity. Lawmakers were presented with a terrifying catalog of fresh, documented abuses from recent field operations, including verified reports of agents spraying chemical agents and tear gas directly into the faces of peaceful community observers, firing pepper balls at legal monitors, and physically harassing individuals who were simply holding vigils outside of federal detention facilities. The push aims to destroy the legal fiction that protects these agents from the consequences of their actions, establishing a clear statutory framework where individual federal actors can finally be sued personally and materially in a court of law for civil rights violations. For decades, absolute immunity has functioned as a blank check for state violence, a shield ensuring that no matter how egregious the overreach, the victim bears the cost while the enforcer walks away untouched. This legislative battle is about shifting that material cost back onto the perpetrators of institutional abuse. As federal overreach faces exposure in the courts and the legislature, the operational integrity of these massive, multi-jurisdictional sweeps is completely disintegrating under independent scrutiny. In Minnesota, the catastrophic fallout from Operation Metro Surge has mutated into a full-blown national scandal. A case study in what happens when federal agencies operate with total disregard for local oversight. Official reviews conducted by legal watchdogs now indicate that federal agents violated at least 96 separate, binding court orders during their recent urban sweeps. The operation has been thoroughly dragged through the mud after masked. Unidentified agents were documented dragging a woman suffering from a severe, documented traumatic brain injury out of her personal vehicle, and subsequently denying her access to immediate medical care. This systemic escalation occurred alongside the high-profile, catastrophic killings of 2 American citizens during botched raids. State officials, local community leaders, and civil rights organizations are no longer using the clinical language of immigration policy. They are defining Operation Metro Surge for what it actually was: a lawless campaign of illegal retribution against sanctuary communities. The resistance to this machinery is not just happening in major metropolitan hubs. It is unfolding in local courthouses across the country where the state is attempting to punish those who speak out. In the Pacific Northwest, jury selection and initial testimony began this week in the federal trial of the Spokane three local anti-deportation activists facing heavy federal conspiracy charges for participating in a protest against ICE detainments. As the trial unfolded, independent media pulled back the layers on the prosecution's star witness, revealing that a supervisory ICE detention officer set to testify has a deeply problematic, documented history of posting inflammatory, hyper-partisan rhetoric on public social media accounts. His posts included explicit demands for local progressive politicians to be arrested and charged with federal incitement for merely expressing rhetorical support for the immigration protests. This revelation has completely compromised the state's narrative, putting the deep-seated ideological motivations, prejudices, and political biases of the enforcement staff on full public display. It proves that these federal prosecutions are not neutral applications of justice. They are political tools used to suppress community organizing and protect the enforcement apparatus from public oversight. Yet, even when the highest courts establish explicit, unmistakable boundaries, the agency continues to push the limits of compliance, demonstrating a complete contempt for judicial authority. A federal district court recently granted a critical stay that largely prohibits civil immigration arrests in or around 3 lower Manhattan federal courthouses. A monumental decision reached only after federal prosecutors were forced to issue a humiliating apology to a judge, admitting they had relied on a deeply flawed, outdated memorandum to justify their aggressive courthouse sweeps. Yet, in a move that showcases the pure arrogance of the apparatus, just 24 hours after that explicit judicial ban was instituted, ICE agents detained a 21-year-old man inside a Manhattan federal building subject to that exact court order. Legal aid groups and public defenders are currently mobilizing an emergency challenge to the arrest, setting up an immediate high-stakes test of whether federal agencies will respect judicial boundaries or choose to operate entirely outside the framework of constitutional law. This defiance of local norms is creating intense structural friction across state lines, exposing the deep political rifts between federal mandates and regional autonomy. In Virginia, a quiet but exceptionally fierce standoff has emerged between federal authorities and state leadership. The Department of Homeland Security is actively putting immense public and private pressure on Governor Abigail Spanberger to force local municipalities to honor federal detainers in Franklin County. The specific case involves an undocumented individual charged with severe crimes, a case that federal authorities are eagerly weaponizing in the corporate media to generate anti-immigrant panic. It has become a localized flashpoint, highlighting the deep operational rift between federal enforcement mandates that seek to conscript local police into federal service, and regional sanctuary policies designed to prioritize local judicial autonomy and community trust over federal directives. But beneath the legal filings, the political gridlock, the legislative campaigns, and the tactical standoffs, lies the raw, devastating human reality of a system that is structurally incapable of processing human nuance or understanding the desperation of survival. On Long Island, federal agents executed an arrest that perfectly illustrates the blind cruelty of this machinery. They detained a young El Salvadoran national who had walked directly into a USCIS office, not to hide, but to actively apply for special immigrant juvenile status, a legal pathway provided by federal law for abandoned or abused youth. Viewed strictly through the cold, unfeeling lens of an enforcement ledger, he was flagged as an MS-13 gang member and immediately taken into custody as a threat to national security. But a closer look at the actual mechanics of transnational violence reveals a far more complex and heartbreaking narrative, one rooted entirely in youth, vulnerability, and a complete absence of choice. In the neighborhoods controlled by these brutal criminal syndicates, young people do not choose enlistment out of ideological loyalty or criminal ambition. They are trapped in a living hell, where the options are narrowed down by the barrel of a gun to a simple, terrifying binary: compliance or death. For a child growing up under the absolute shadow of cartel and gang violence, recruitment is not a choice, it is a vice grip. Forcing a young person into a gang is a standard mechanism of survival for the syndicate, and compliance is often the only way for that youth to keep their parents and younger siblings alive. This young man wasn't an architect of terror. He was a survivor trying desperately to escape a living hell, seeking a legitimate legal pathway out of a nightmare through a federal youth advocacy program, only to find that the very sanctuary promised by the law was actually used as an operational trap. When we strip away the clinical, dehumanizing terminology of the enforcement bureaucracy, we are left with the reality of a system designed to process human beings as mere statistics, completely ignoring the structures of geopolitical violence that drive them across borders in the first place. The pushback we are documenting today, from the courtrooms of Chicago to the agricultural fields of Oregon, proves that communities are no longer willing to accept this status quo. The erosion of institutional credibility happens slowly, until it happens all at once, exposed by body cameras, leaked memos, and the courage of everyday people willing to document the truth and stand their ground against power. And as always, remember, open hearts, open minds,